This is video, right?
This is audio, perhaps some video clips. I try desperately not to pick my nose, but it's hard
Well,
to
I
do.
wouldn't. If I knew it was all audio, I wouldn't have put on this shirt. I don't know if you can see, but I like have sweatpants on and my dress shirt. So,
You got to put on. I've done that more often than not.
yeah. Anyway, feel free to use that too.
That's a good promo clip right there. Yeah.
Well, at least you have pants on. Sometimes I have
Yeah,
just
right.
boxer
That's
shorts
true.
on. So.
Welcome to the Reintegrate podcast, where we investigate how to apply the Christian faith to all of life. I'm David Loughney.
And I'm Bob Robinson.
We've designed this podcast to have two generational perspectives. Bob has just turned 60 and I have just turned 30. So, hey, look at us. We are blessed to have authors and thought leaders on the podcast to help us to reintegrate our lives so that everything we think, feel, and do is integrated with our Christian faith.
Some of us are history buffs. We watch historical documentaries and read books that tell histories. In fact, some of the best-selling books are narrative histories. But what is the purpose of studying history? And why should Christians study history? How do we reintegrate our faith with our understanding of the past?
So our guest today is Dr. John Fia, Distinguished Professor of American History at Messiah University in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. He has recently released a second edition of his book, Why Study History? Reflecting on the Importance of the Past. And in this book, he talks about what historians do, what bad history looks like, and how studying history can be a form of spiritual formation.
So, John, it's good to have you back on the podcast.
Yeah, good to be back. I understand this is my third visit, right?
Third visit.
Wow,
Yeah.
wow. I'm honored.
Well, David, John and I lived on the same dorm floor in divinity school. I was studying to be a pastor, and John was studying to be a historian. John, I have fond memories of those times.
Yeah, those were fun days. I often think about them a lot.
Right?
I recently had couple text exchanges with another guy on that floor, Paul Quivinen, who
Oh, Paul.
who was a missionary, and he's doing well. And Vince Baycoat, went on to become a famous theologian at Wheaton. Trying to think who else, but that was a good floor.
It was a good floor, and we had a lot of fun, a lot of creativity, and a lot of camaraderie.
Yeah,
I didn't go
yeah.
away to college, and so having that dorm experience was like my first
Okay.
experience with living with a bunch of
Yeah.
guys on a floor, and
Yeah.
it was an amazing experience. I really loved it.
Well, you look back nostalgically on it, but then at the same time, it's like we also drove each other nuts, with all the noise and everything.
And Trinity, they were so kind to put us in these dormitories that were like 400 years old with no air conditioning.
Right. Yeah.
Well, John, any good stories about Bob are more than welcome, and more embarrassing the better. Yeah,
We used to call
sounds
him
good.
Double B. I used to call him Double B.
He
back in
walked
those-
by my dorm room, and every time at first he would say "Big Bob," and he'd walk by "Big
Big
Bob,"
Bob. Yeah, that's right.
and then it just got shortened to Double B.
That's
I gave a
great.
nickname to everybody on the floor. I remember.
Everybody on the floor.
So, yeah, crazy.
So you went on to get a Ph.D. and now you're teaching history at Messiah University. So question number one is what do you teach there, and what do you like about teaching history?
Yeah, so I've been after Trinity, I got a PhD from the State University of New York at Stony Brook out on Long Island in the New York metropolitan area, which was home for me. I grew up in northern New Jersey and sort of New York metropolitan, somewhat home, same kind of metropolitan area. Spent 2 years teaching as a postdoc in a Lilly endowed program at Valparaiso University for people who are interested in teaching at church-related higher education schools, colleges, and then have been at Messiah now. This is my 23rd year at Messiah. Messiah has been a good fit for me. It's a school that has serious Christian roots, some evangelical roots, but also roots in the Anabaptist tradition. It was founded by a denomination known as the Brethren in Christ, which has this unique blend of evangelical pietism, Wesleyanism, and Anabaptism. I come from an evangelical background, or at least I in my adult years I converted to evangelicalism. So it's a good fit for me in terms of learning from, especially the Anabaptist tradition. Questions of peace and justice and those kinds of things are always circulating in the air at Messiah. It's also a really good place to teach history, because the school, of course, has a unique history. You're constantly trying to explain, why, for example, we don't fly an American flag on campus, or those kinds of things, because the Anabaptists always kind of thought about the kingdom of God being much more important than the nation state, those kinds of issues. But I enjoy teaching at a liberal arts college like Messiah because I find it academically free. And that might seem strange to like a secular viewer of the podcast who maybe teaches at a major university, right? Don't you have to sign all these things? Don't you have to, be a Christian to teach there? What do you mean free? It seems like you're limited. And it's depending how you define freedom. I mean, in some ways that would be a correct assessment that such a person would make. But at the same time, I like it because I'm free to kind of bring my Christian faith to bear on the discipline of history. So I like to tell like prospective students that if you come to a place like Messiah, you are going to get a first-rate liberal arts history degree. But at the same time, you're going to get this kind of value integrated. I used to say value added, but it's not really added; it's integrated, into the curriculum. And I get the opportunity to challenge students to think about the human experience as it unfolds throughout time. What does the reality say of human sin? How does that help us understand human behavior, no matter what the time period, right? Or how do we think about human dignity in the way that we, the Imago Dei, for example, in the way we construct a history curriculum, whose voices count? Are there voices that count more than others, right? And the answer is clearly no, on that front. Mm-hmm. Well, what does that mean in terms of how one teaches, the texts one assigns? You can come to these conclusions, I think, without Christian faith. But I think what happens at a place at Messiah is students come, a lot of them come from evangelical institutions or churches, youth groups and so forth. And some of them are very eager to kind of think Christianly about how to engage the study of the past. So that continues to motivate me, and to get students to think historically about the world, think about the world in terms of things like context, right? Or contingency, right? Choices that people make, that if they chose this way, the whole course of this particular historical movement might have gone in another direction than it did. Or, the complexity of human beings that I think is so, so important today in our kind of binary culture where we tend to think about, social media exacerbates this, this idea of thinking in terms of black and white, or, you're either X or Y. And, if you're not Y, if you're Y, you should be canceled by the people who are in X, or, something to that effect. So I think that's what history does. That's the kind of stuff that gets me up in the morning. Most people kind of, man on the street, woman on the street, it's, oh, you, and I think I say this in the book at some point, right? Your job is to kind of torture kids with facts and dates and make them memorize things. And, but I'm not interested in that actually either. When it comes to teaching.
You also said in the book that, a lot of history professors, academics they like their upper class, their history majors
Yeah.
classes, but you like that introduction to American history class that every college student
Yeah.
has to take. Why do you enjoy that class so much?
Yeah, in academic circles, in sort of history circles, we just had I wasn't there, but we just had our big national conference where like 6,000 historians come to a city. It was in New York this year, the American Historical Association meeting. And, if you surveyed that crowd, people would say like, I want to try to avoid teaching the survey at all costs. I'd much rather teach, the subject of my dissertation, or something. It would be the equivalent of like a biblical scholar kind of wanting to teach a course on like Malachi, for like an entire semester, as opposed to a kind of survey of, the Old Testament or something like that.
Right.
I love that course because that course is a general education course. The students in that class have to take one history course at Messiah. And most of them probably don't want to be there or they're trying to get through it. They're lamenting the fact that they didn't do well on their AP exam. And they didn't do well enough so that they could skip this, kind of thing. But that I look at it as a kind of almost like a kind of evangelism, for history, right? To get them to say, like, here's a way of thinking about the world. Here's a different way, an unnatural in some ways way of thinking about society. Historians think about the world differently than most other people in other disciplines. And I want to be able to say, I don't care if they remember like the four reasons why, World War I happened, right? They can look that up on the internet. They can, if they need that like 20 years from now, somehow they need that for a job or, whatever. But I want a shot at getting them to sort of think about the world contextually in terms of contingency. I call them these 5 C's of historical thinking in the book. And that'll be the only shot they get. And I think the way in which a lot of colleges and universities now are kind of reconstructing their curriculums, and especially those who are making huge cuts to the humanities and these disciplines, it's becoming increasingly more rare to even have a shot at getting non-history majors, a chemistry major or an engineering major or a nursing major to actually think historically these days. So I enjoy that class. I teach it every fall and it's my favorite.
I loved history growing up, and I loved learning it in school. It was actually one of my favorite subjects growing up. Especially, I think I can contribute that to the teachers I had. They were very good storytellers. Even though it was history, it was factual data they were sharing with us.
Yeah.
They made it sound like this big story that was all connected and bringing in these
Yeah.
characters that made me think differently. And
Yeah.
then they also helped me connect the dots of, okay, because it was like this back then, this is why this is this way now.
Yeah.
Or this is what the Industrial Revolution brought us.
Yeah.
And just all of these different things, which was really, really cool to me. Specifically, there's a professor at Kent State University, and he taught an introductory course. And I just remember all the students just hated that class. They did not want to be there. And I was just one of those students where I'm like, oh, I actually really enjoy this because history wasn't my
Yeah.
major, but I'm like, I actually think he's a great teacher. I
I
loved
think
that class.
I think just to follow up on those points, because they're great points, right? I think the point about the storytelling, the point about the narrative, right? A historian will weave a story, basically, which you just pointed out, David, right? They're not just doing that for their health, right? Or to sort of make the facts interesting or like the pill easier to swallow. I think there is this sense, and it took me a while even to learn this, where I think a good historian, and I can speak about, say, American history because that's what I teach, right? A good historian kind of weaves a story of the nation and its development, with all its flaws, with all its bright spots, right? A complex story of the nation, and then tries to invite you as the student to see yourself as part of that narrative, to break down the kind of individualistic kind of, in some extreme cases, kind of almost narcissistic idea that like, the world revolves around me and all the benefits and the struggles and the life that I live today has somehow been either self-made or is all of my own doing, when you are actually, what I want my students to see is they are part of a much larger, longer narrative that sort of decenters you, right? That sort of says, well, whoa. I was just last fall, I was, or I was asking my students, we gave them a survey, right? We were exploring this whole concept of democracy historically, right? So I wanted to, like, you talked about how the past informs the present, right? How we got to where we are. That's, historians call that continuity, right? I wanted to draw some continuity into the story. We gave them this survey. I co-teach this class with another historian. We asked them, would you give up your right to vote in a presidential election, in one presidential election, for a new, whatever the latest, like Apple or Android, whatever device is, iPhone, iPad, right? You get a free one for giving up your right to vote for 1 year. The second question was, would you give up your right to vote forever, right, as a citizen for $1 million? And then the third question, would you give up your right to vote for a year for a full ride to Messiah College? And they're like, it's like 90%, would do that. And you listen to their rationalizations and it's like, well, I could be so much of a better future citizen if I had a 4-year degree. So it's worth the 1 year, right? And they come up with all these crazy, And then the fourth question is, do you believe one vote makes a difference? So on the iPhone question, they're like, probably like 40% of the class would give up their right to vote for 1 year for an iPhone. The Messiah full ride question, I said, is in the 90s. What was this? I can't remember. What was the second question? The
Right to vote forever for $1 million.
For $1 million, yeah, probably about 50% would do that. But then we read a passage from the 19th century commentator on American culture, Alexis de Tocqueville. Some of your listeners may have heard of Tocqueville. And Tocqueville has this wonderful passage where he talks about, in a democracy, the past is erased and everybody falls upon their own individual selves. They forget where they've come from. They don't even think about the future and what they're leaving for future generations, because it's all about them in the moment. And then we start to reflect on, right? There are people who have fought for decades and decades and decades in American history to get just the right to vote. Or we talk about, like, in South Africa, where, when apartheid ended, they lined up for hours just to be able to cast a vote. For 12 hours they waited in line. And you're willing to throw it all away for, we try to be nice. Don't want to be too stern on them, but there's a failure to see themselves as part of a larger story, a human story that has affected them and shaped them, right? It's all about, well, I'd get the iPhone, immediate gratification, or full ride to Messiah or whatever. And again, I don't judge them, because I probably would maybe make some of the similar choices, especially if I was given like a 4-year college degree just to not vote for a year. I don't want to judge them or say it's right or wrong. I want them to see how, I don't put it this way to them, but how I'm up there working, I'm emptying the tank every day in lecture and in class, trying to get them to see themselves as part of a larger story. And they're just saying, "Hey, you flash me the iPhone. Who cares? Like, I don't care about Susan B. Anthony or the 13th Amendment. So I think that's what's fun about it. But it's also, I think, what makes it a kind of inherently moral kind of exercise that decenters oneself, that sees oneself as part of something bigger than just the moment that they're in. And in that way, it can be a very humbling discipline."
As you were saying that, I'm like, oh, I'm going to take $1 million. Like, I don't know. But I think my mind also immediately went to the guilt of the people that have died for the right to vote, or,
Yeah.
what women have had to go through to vote, or people of color or race. And like, there's so many complications where it's like,
Yep.
this was this person's life that they couldn't vote. And so they did everything they could with all their resources. And
But for me,
So,
David, the issue is not, sorry to interrupt.
no, you're
The
good.
issue for me is not like, should you do it or not? There could be a real legitimate reason to take $1 million for whatever your circumstances are, or right. My job is to at least get them to consider the questions and the complexity of the issue, and to say, well, I'm not here to tell you what to do or how to decide those questions. I want you to, at least when you do decide, to think about something just beyond the immediate gratification of, and
Yeah, because again, my first thought was like, ooh, $1 million, I'm gonna snatch that off the table. But
yeah,
then, to have that follow-up thought of like, well, just for a moment, think about all the people and
yeah.
society that has come before you that has even given you that opportunity to
And
have
what
that
makes me
choice.
bang my head against the wall is that the default position of most Americans is to take the $1 million, right? I like to use this phrase, our psychological condition at rest is to take the $1 million, to take the free ride, to take the iPad. And that's what I feel I'm up against. And that battle is getting much more difficult the more we live in a kind of consumer driven, the more the pursuit of happiness, as Jefferson defines it, is defined by, goods and, possessions and, these kinds of. One quick funny story. This fall, I had my first one ever on the iPhone question. I think the way I phrase the question is, I think I say the most recent Apple product, and I think I put in parentheses like iPhone, iPad, watch, whatever, you pick. So I had a student where we were rehashing the answers and stuff. I asked them to share, why they picked what they picked. And I had one student who said, I said I would not give up my vote for an Apple product. I would definitely still keep my vote for that year because I'm more of an Android guy. I was like, oh my God. It's like, like, oh, that's what you got out of it.
You
Like, if it was an
totally missed
Android,
it.
I would have took it. He
I
was a,
think you
he was a
missed the
good
point,
sport.
dude.
Yeah, he was a good sport about it. I really got on him, and like, we had a good
Uh,
laugh about it. But he was like, yeah.
That's that's funny. So like I mentioned, I went to Kent State University, had a great history professor there that I enjoyed. And Bob was actually my campus minister at Kent State. That's where we met. And so our audience includes a few friends of mine who graduated from there with history degrees. And many of us are just history buffs, but we have not been formally trained as historians. So we are maybe not as discerning about the history we consume. In the book, you encourage us to think like historians who adhere to the 5 C's of historical thinking. So, can you walk us through those 5 C's and why not adhering to these can make for bad history?
Yeah, sure. I think at the heart of the bad history that comes when we don't think in terms of these 5 C's, or these historical ways of thinking, I think at the kind of root of that is the way in which we as a society teach people how to read. And real quick, here's what I mean by that before I get into the details of the 5 C's. Most students will have their reading comprehension, or their ability to read, measured by like a standardized test. Let's just take, say, the SAT or the ACT, right? Where you're given a kind of disembodied passage. Maybe there's a reference to what it's from, right? But it's this disembodied passage, and you're asked questions about the passage. Like in paragraph 3, like, give me an example of sort of foreshadowing, or, what is the point? These literary questions. Most of the time you have no idea who the author is. You have no idea when it was written, or they never ask you questions about when the document was written and how your interpretation of that text might be affected by when it was written or who wrote it, or you don't know where the document sits in a larger historical context. So you can tell the test graders or whatever, you could tell them stuff that's going on in the text in terms of what the text is saying, but you have no clue what the text is actually doing. And what I mean by that is, like, why did the person who wrote this text feel the need to write it? What is the larger point here that this text is trying to make? I'm talking about nonfiction for the most part, right? Where was it published, right? All of these questions are essential to kind of being critical readers. And I'm not just talking about test takers. I'm talking about people who pick up the newspaper or read online now, right? The news and how to process the news. It's like I always say, this idea between what is the text saying versus what a text is doing, right? So you imagine a Facebook post, right? You have a friend who, writes on Facebook, won the award for best sermon in my seminary today, so happy or whatever. And, so I asked, what is that? What is that saying? What is that post saying? Well, it's pretty obvious, right? This person is saying that they won this award, right? And then, but what is that face post doing? Well, there could be a lot of different answers to that question, right? But in order to know what the post is doing, you have to know something about the person who wrote it. You maybe have to compare that post with other posts that this person has made. You need to develop some kind of context in which the post takes place. So, it could just be like, yeah, I've known this guy my whole life. I can marshal evidence from 100 different posts that this guy is arrogant. He likes to brag. And this is what he's doing here, right? Or you could say, this must be really meaningful to him because he's a real humble guy. Like I have evidence to suggest that right? But you're putting that post in context and then you're really understanding what the author's trying to do with the post. Or maybe it's just like, my mom's sick right now and she needs this encouragement that I won this award. You don't know, right? But the act of historical interpretation is to try to figure out what those texts are doing. And that's a different kind of reading. And I think it's a kind of reading, I think, that's really helpful in our democracy, especially in our disinformation world, fake news, of these kinds of things, to kind of think not only here's what the document's saying, but what is it trying to accomplish? What is it doing? So when you think about what a text is trying to, or what a statement is trying to do, you need to think about it in terms of, I would argue, historians would argue, these 5 C's, right? Complexity, how is this document or this person or this event complex? In other words, we tend to paint with these broad brushes, right? Either this person is a racist or this person is woke. In other words, we should remove this monument to this person because they held slaves, despite the fact that they also did this, this, and this. Like, we're not interested in that kind of complexity, but historians are, in terms of trying to interpret how to read and how to think about public displays or whatever they might be. Contingency, I already talked about this one, right? This is tied into sort of how people make choices. Right. I mean, a historian, I'm writing a book right now where I'm arguing that there was a moment where a group had an opportunity to go one direction with their public policy and their thinking, but instead they went another direction. And that then led to this, this, and this, and this. And that's where we are today. But if they took the other turn, which was, you can't talk about contingency unless the other option is a legitimate option. You can't just make it up, right? You can't just say, well, if they only did this, you have to be able to have evidence to suggest that they very well could have moved this way, but they chose not to, right? It's not just like, oh, if they only, flew to the Mars instead of the moon first. Well, flying to Mars would have been not a possibility, right? But contingency suggests that, these choices were made and they resulted in things. Context, right? Understanding the past, understanding events within the particular context in which they happen might change your interpretation of what went on, or at least nuance it a little bit. Is white supremacy, for example, a concept that looks different in the 19th century than it does in the 21st century? Now, in some ways, no. White supremacy is white supremacy, right? But how should we think about white supremacy? Again, it's not a moral question whether white supremacy is good or bad, right? But how might white supremacy be better understood when virtually everyone was a white supremacist in a particular society, right? That might raise different kinds of questions about the idea, context, causality, right? Not just, what happened, but why it happened. And then I'm blanking on the 5th one, complexity.
Change over time.
Of course. Yeah. Change over time, right? I think so often we tend to see the past as frozen in time. I think this is kind of the way in which, say, originalists interpret the Constitution, right? We need to understand what they thought in the 18th century and then apply that today as if nothing happened in between, right? There was no change that happened in American society, American life. And this gets more, when you don't acknowledge change over time, you're basically developing a kind of politics of nostalgia where you look back to this golden era and then want to like lift that golden era over all of the time and then like insert it now.
Mm.
When no, a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then. So I like to say, I think I say this in the book, I think I'm quoting the historian Gordon Wood here, where, historians see something beginning A and ending, or the present rather, is B, and their job is to explain what happened between A and B, perhaps even more than just trying to tell you what A was like,
Mm.
right? And that's the continuity. That's where I like to say historians are always weary from time travel because a lot of people like to think we just live in these past societies and think, but we're constantly thinking about the way those past societies reflect who we are today. And we're going back and forth in a way that no other kind of intellectual or thinker or people exercising whatever discipline do, because most disciplines are not particularly interested in change over time in the way that historians are.
Right.
So yeah, that's right. That's quick, but yeah.
You kept saying in the book that the past is a quote unquote foreign country, that we need to embrace the utter strangeness of people who lived in the past and put aside our natural inclination to consume the past for our own narcissistic purposes. So,
Yeah.
how can engaging in the otherness of the people of history transform us for life today?
This is, I think, where I run into the most opposition from the historical profession, as well as even Christians within the historical profession. Because I think sometimes Christians within the historical profession are even more guilty of what I'm about to say than non-Christians. And maybe I'll explain why here in a second. But there is a again, back to this psychological condition, right, at rest. There is this natural inclination to want to consume the past and to use it in the present, to take what you need from the past to advance whatever agenda you want. That's fine. People do it all the time. I'm not opposed to that and so forth, but that's easy, right? If I want to say American evangelicalism today, right, is this, I can find what I need in the past to justify that. It's easy to do. What's more difficult is to explain the past, to have sort of the integrity of the past, respect the integrity of the past to such a degree that you understand it in all its fullness and complexity. And sometimes that might mean there's parts of the past that we don't like, don't serve present day purposes, we can't use, right? It's not usable. The historian has a responsibility to try to understand and empathize with. Now, when I use the term empathy here, I don't mean sympathy always. I think one can try to walk in the shoes of someone that they may not like, who lived in the past, and try to understand why they acted or said or did the things that they did without necessarily agreeing morally with what they did. So, the people in the past are dead. They're helpless, right? Our job is to try to understand them, and then let the ethicists and the moralists, let them decide whether they're right or wrong, So what I try to suggest in the book is that people think you change the world. Historians are in the business of changing the world because they go back in the past and show how things were like really bad and how we need to move beyond those things. Or they say, look how good it was back then, and we can use this to advance whatever agenda we want in the present. And that way, you're going to make the modern day world a better place, right? 2025 a better place. And I don't disagree with that. But I think the very act of trying to empathize with somebody, no matter what their moral position or how their moral position relates to what you believe, has a certain virtue to it because it forces you to see the world from the perspective of someone that's very, very different than you. So here's an example. I taught a class in colonial America last fall. And, we have this section where we spent a few days on the Salem witch trials, right? And I always tell the students, they're trying to figure out, like, why did these people burn witches in 1692 in Massachusetts, these New Englanders, right? Why did they burn witches? And the students get incredibly uncomfortable when I say to them, if I believed that there was a Satan, if I believed that this Satan manifested himself in people and that wanted to do me harm and maybe even destroy my internal soul, right, and send me to hell forever, if that so dominated my worldview, right, again, I'm not saying right or wrong, I'm saying if that's what I believed, I probably want to kill the witches too, right? And then, everyone's like, oh, like, wow, how do, I'm like, well, again, I'm not suggesting that this is what we should do or that it's right. But in that world of 17th century Puritan New England, this was a logical thing for some people to want to hang a witch, right? Now, again, there were other people who didn't see it logical, and we need to take their accounts, the critics of the witch trials. But the very fact that I am forced to try to understand why someone would want to hang a witch or someone that would believe in witchcraft, right? That's taking my students into a foreign country, right? A world that's very, very different from their own, and a world that I want them to try to understand before they condemn, and maybe they should rightly condemn it. Right. But I want to take them into that world and say, here is why. The reason I do that is because I think there are certain virtues. I think they are democratic virtues. They are virtues for living together in a civil society. I think history will train you, if you spend time immersed in its study, will train you to see the world from the perspective of someone else, even someone you might find morally reprehensible. And maybe in your first job out of college, that morally reprehensible person is in the cubicle next to you, right? And you have to live with them and understand them and try to see why they see the world the way they do. You don't have to agree with them, right? But I think this is what the past as a foreign country does. What I want to suggest is that is as much of a world-changing set of skills that could help change the world as, well, look at how bad it was, and, we need to overcome all these bad isms that occurred, or, right, we need to go back in the past and find heroes, so that we could be better in the present, right? I think the very discipline of historical empathy, of listening to past voices, has a profound world-changing dimension to it. When I say that, there are certain kind of more activist historians who will immediately critique me, and I've been critiqued from all sides on this, to say, well, by just studying the past on its own terms, you're just not, what's the point? But the very exercise, the discipline, it's almost like a habit, right? In this sense, history is not only a discipline like sociology or English or, one of these disciplines, but it requires a certain kind of ascetic discipline to be able to say, I'm going to lay aside my modern way of viewing this person and try to understand, at least for a moment, before I critique them, why they're acting the way that they are. And, I actually think people who are activists, who want to use the past to advance social causes, I think even practicing this way of thinking about the past will make them a better activist, because they'll at least, they'll understand their enemy or the people they're trying to counter much, much better than the kind of thing we have today, where you have like two talking heads screaming at each other with this sort of shallow understanding of each other's positions.
Yeah, well, as Christians, I mean, that there can be another level of complexity when speaking with other Christians, and we we believe in the providence of God, that Jesus is the sovereign, and then he oversees God's creation and works out God's plans for it. But you say that whereas theology is the study of character and behavior of God, history is the study of character and behavior of humans as they live through time. And you've touched on this, but how is a book on how God did this or that in history, how is that problematic? For example, like the book mentioned here, The Light and the Glory by Peter Marshall and David Manuel. How do we add now that kind of layer of complexity?
Yeah, yeah. Providence is everywhere these days. Everybody thinks God's anointing this person or that person, or God's on the side of this cause or that cause. I was just reading the other day. I read it dozens and dozens of times and taught it dozens and dozens of times. Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, which I think is one of the most theologically astute statements ever made by an American president, where he says, both read the same Bible, both prayed to the same God in the Civil War, right? Yet the Almighty has his own purposes, right? And you compare that with like some of the popular preachers of the day, like Henry Ward Beecher or whatever, who they were like, the South, because of their racism and their dividing of the Union, need to be cast into hell and punished and da 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 because God is opposed to, and you're kind of like, and then here's this guy who's like not really even a Christian, kind of having this view of this humble kind of view, and sort of showing up all the theologians of the day who believe, northern theologians, right, who believe that the purpose of the Civil War was God casting his divine punishment down on the South. And interestingly enough, just to not get off track, but and punishing the South not because they even held slavery, but because they broke up the sacred union, by seceding. But anyways, I say this in the book. I'm a Christian and I believe in the doctrine of providence, right? I believe, I think even if you're not a kind of Calvinist or a hardcore Calvinist, I think, you can believe that God is somehow orchestrating and controlling human events, whatever that looks like. Again, I'm not a theologian and don't really care to be one or don't want to speculate on that any further, right? But I think providence is a really unhealthy and bad tool for historical inquiry. And frankly, this might be a little controversial. I think it's a really bad tool for even theological inquiry. So I tell my students, like they'll be like, why did God do this? Or why did God allow this? Or why did God bring up the fog? This is the Light and the Glory book you're talking about, right? Why did God bring up the fog in August of 1776 to help George Washington escape in the night? It must have been providential because, of course, God's on the side of the United States in the American Revolution, right? I'm saying that facetiously. I hope your listeners get that. Maybe he was. I don't know. I don't know. Apparently they won. I don't know why they won. So they'll ask me this, and I'll say, I don't know. I have no idea. I'm much more interested as a historian in like the choices, contingency, right? The choices that Washington made and why he did this and so forth. And then I say, you want to understand why God did it? Go ask your theology prof. But I guarantee you, he doesn't know either, or she doesn't know either, right? So I'm not sure how helpful providence is in any discipline that tries to understand human behavior. That doesn't mean I reject the idea that God doesn't have some master plan, but the verse I like to throw out as a Christian and as a historian is 1 Corinthians 13:12. Most of my students think about 1 Corinthians 13 when they're at a wedding and the love chapter, but 13:12 is that classic verse where we see through a glass darkly. Only then will we see clearly, only then face to face, right? I think it's a really good verse for Christians to hold on to when they're trying to interpret things. We do this all the time, right? I do this. I think I was just doing it the other day, talking to my wife. You say like, man, the Lord really led us through that. Or, later in life, you look back and you say like, I can see maybe why the Lord did that, or why, or why I made that decision. I could see why the Lord was leading me to do this or to that. I could see now what the results are. And I'm even a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to that kind of thing. I'm kind of like, yeah, but perhaps. I love the word maybe or perhaps, right? This seems like something the Lord was doing, but I may get to eternity one day and find out, oh, the whole purpose of that was this, and not, in other words, I like to think at least my God is too big, is much bigger than some providential historian telling me like what God was doing at this moment or that moment. I'd much rather make an appeal to mystery and perhaps. That's not that you could not speculate, especially in a Christian college, why was God doing this? What was God doing? Why was, but to me, it's the idea of certainty that is just really theologically problematic. And also historically just doesn't help us to understand what happened. I'd much rather lean upon Christian theological ideas like I mentioned earlier, like the doctrine of human sin or the Imago Dei than I do kind of casting these providential, God has anointed this person or God is doing this in the world. It's just not a historical question. I
Yeah.
think that doesn't mean I don't believe in providence, but I think I learned the word perhaps or maybe actually from N.T. Wright. I was reading something by him on providence. I think it might even have made it into the book where
Yeah.
he mentioned something to the effect of, maybe, perhaps this is what God is doing. And I think that's just a healthy way of kind of respecting the mystery of God in that way.
And so, as a historian, there's resources from the Christian tradition that you're able to use in
Yes.
doing good history. But one of those resources is not to try to guess what God is doing,
Yeah. Yeah.
because nobody knows the mind of God. So
Yeah.
that's when it gets crazy. But like you said, the image of God. Okay, so what does the image of God have to do about how I do history? I see every person I'm studying as someone with dignity, someone that I should care about, someone that
Yeah.
I might actually love.
Yeah.
Even if I would count them as an enemy today, I am
Exactly.
called to love them,
Yeah. Love dead people.
love my dead people.
Yeah. I
And
mean, that nails it, right? That gets to the
uh,
whole point I made before about like walking in the shoes of somebody else. Seeing the dignity of another person, even if that person, if they were alive today, would be your enemy or that you would
yeah,
disagree with. What does that look like? And it's hard to do. It really is hard to do it. And this is where I have this whole chapter where I said it actually for me as a Christian and for what I try to teach my students, it requires a certain sense of spiritual discipline to be able to do that. To be able to try to understand a 19th century slaveholder and what they're doing is going to require, what Reinhold Niebuhr talked about, this kind of spiritual discipline against resentment, right? Or to try to forgive or try to, those are radical kind of things that I'm not usually that, I sometimes feel like a hypocrite because they're
yeah.
not things that I often do very well in my own spiritual life, right? But I'm trying to get my students to do that with some kind of historical figure, right?
You have the image of God, which is the positive, but then you have the sinfulness, the depravity of humanity. And so
Yeah,
that informs a historian because it's like, of course, these people are making bad decisions. They're
yeah,
sinful people. And
yeah,
look at the consequences of their decisions. My job as a historian is not to judge their actions, but to actually look at the consequences and to map those things out, right? And see what did they do and why did they do it and what happened because of that. That's the things we're
yeah.
supposed to be looking for.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I love the quote I have in the book by George Marsden where he says, I'm not going to get it right, but he says something like, the doctrine of I think he says original sin. The doctrine of original sin is a doctrine that has the most verifiable evidence in human history, or something like that.
Right.
There's this sense in which, how do you explain certain kinds of behavior and so forth that seem just totally contradicting a kind of enlightenment progressive kind of trajectory of history, right? Where all humans are good and they're always going to make the right choices. I mean, some theology, right, Bob? I mean, it's the whole kind of late 19th century kind of these theologians, Schleiermacher and others about human goodness and so forth. And then like World War I hits, World War II hits, and it just looks like these defenders of progress and the utopian human community that's going to be formed out of all love and whatever is just racked up against human sin. I mean, these are categories I think that help a historian explain what's going on. Yeah.
So a historian, it's kind of both a science and an art, right? And much like any other profession, I love the fact that in one of your chapters, you say what you're talking about more is about a theology of work. And
Yeah.
here at Reintegrate, that's what we're all about. It. So what is a
Yeah.
good theology of work? What does it
Yeah.
look like to do good work, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the Christian things that we have that could kind of inform my good work? And
Yeah.
so most of us are just lay historians, and some of the stuff that we're getting is bunk. It's just bad stuff. And so the goal of this episode of the podcast, John, is to try to help us be more discerning, to try to think through how do I, as a lay person, as a person trying to read history, how do I know what I'm reading is worthy of contemplation, or am I being manipulated by somebody who has an
Yeah.
agenda that I don't know about, or that I may do know about and I like because that's why I'm reading it actually, or something.
Yeah. I think that's where these seas of historical thinking come in, right?
Mhm.
It may not be a kind of extreme kind of manipulation kind of story, but let's just say you're reading something comes across your screen about some political issue that you disagree with, or if you understood, well, this is the context, right? Here's the website that comes from. I know that this website always kind of promotes this kind of view. I'm obviously still going to take the piece that I'm looking at on the argument on face value, right? Is the argument legit what it's saying? But I might be more skeptical in reading the argument because it came from a certain kind of site. So I think that's a skill that's important. This is what I was getting out before earlier about the disembodied passage, right? You don't know where it was published, right? Or if I'm reading something in, say, the National Review, a conservative magazine, I might go looking for another subject on the topic that's coming from a different kind of writer. This is why we source documents, right? So if I'm reading something, I want to know who the author is, right? Could the author have a bias? Maybe the author doesn't. Maybe the author looks like they should have a bias, but it's a pretty fair piece, right? I'm not. But who's the author? What can I expect? If I see a tweet by, say, Charlie Kirk on Twitter, I'm going to try to see what the tweet says based on its merits, but I'm going to start raising all kinds of questions about that because I know Charlie Kirk only tweets for a particular political agenda and doesn't really care about nuance or complexity, right? So I might go look at another document to try to put that tweet into context. I think these are all skills that come from just basic liberal learning and doing, sort of learning how to think about the world in complex and nuanced ways. And that's what historians kind of offer. In some ways, history is always going to be subjective. You can get two different perspectives that seem, could be legitimate interpretations of the same event that are come down on sort of different political sides, right? Was Jimmy Carter a good president or a bad president? Well, I was reading Jacobin the other day, a socialist magazine, and they were complaining that Carter was a bad president because he introduced all this deregulation and led to Reagan, and let's not celebrate this guy too much, right? Then I read Randy Ballmer's critique of the religious historian Randy Ballmer, who sort of really sympathizes with Carter's kind of progressive evangelicalism, and he's kind of basically suggesting that Carter was the greatest president ever. Then you have conservatives I read Al Mohler, who couldn't even grit his teeth and say anything kind about Carter, right? And all of those three pieces I just mentioned had some pretty, they had facts in there. They got the history right, you know, uh, but they just had different takes on what that history meant. So I'm not suggesting that like, I think we need to be much more critical readers of, who's the author, where's the author coming from, what is the author doing with Carter's death, right? Well, they're all trying to advance some particular agenda, whether it be
Mm,
socialism, conservative Southern Baptist theology, or progressive evangelicalism. But
mm.
just to know that, right, as opposed to just seeing one of those things and taking it at face value just because it's online, right? I mean, is a step in the right direction.
If you're a Carter historian, you're going to understand all those nuances, and you're going to go,
Yeah,
Carter did this, yes, and he did that, yes, and he
yeah,
did this, yes,
exactly.
and it's complex, and it's not easy to categorize, and
Yeah,
so
I mean, so if you're gonna, this is a debate going on among some scholars, and I'm not sure how much it's trickled down into like the non-historical scholarly world. But like, what is American evangelicalism, right? Is it essentially a movement of white supremacy, patriarchy, Christian nationalism, or is it a movement of people following the Bible, right, and living according to the Word of God, right? And it's thus inherently good, with no problems, and it has not corrupted itself in any way over the years, right? I think there's some Christians who want to say, and non-Christians who want to say it's all about white supremacy, patriarchy, so on and so forth, and they then portray a picture of American evangelicalism historically or even in the present as those things, right? Then you have others who write these kind of glowing, almost hagiographical kind of, the great, the John Woodbridge, Bob, this reference to our church history professor, the John Woodbridge, great Christians of, whatever those books he wrote, where, it was all these great Christian people, who are these bios of like great heroes of the faith, which is also somewhat true, right? But I mean, obviously the story is much more complex and nuanced than those two views.
yeah. You talk about how in your previous book was America founded as a Christian nation. You'd go on a campus or you'd go on a radio show, and nobody was happy with your answer because you'd
No,
say, "Well, it's kind of complex." It's like, no, I
yeah,
want you to tell me yes or no.
yeah, yeah. I think this too I think this is a huge problem with just kind of our culture today. Life, the human experience, and all historians know this, even though they sometimes are bad at some of them are bad at acknowledging it in their work. But the human experience is just so complex, right? If you do believe that we're created in the image of God, but also deeply flawed, I think like I like Scott McKnight's phrase, right? We're cracked icons. They're using EIKON, the Greek. We're created in the image of God, like an icon, but I think that's the way the Septuagint uses the word image. And then yet we're cracked, right, as a result of Genesis 3. And if you're going to embrace that idea, how could you not see the human experience, whether today or as it develops over time, in a kind of complex kind of way? But yet, what's rewarded in terms of audience, in terms of power, in terms of clicks, in terms of likes, in terms of speaking gigs, in terms of funding, is the binary, unnuanced kind of way of thinking. Just look at the people on social media who have huge followings in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, and just read their site, read their feeds. What you're going to find on those feeds is not any kind of complexity, but it's going to be railing against, singing one note, railing against the same thing over and over again. And that's what people are attracted to. No one wants to fund or support or celebrate nuance and complexity because it doesn't quite get us anywhere. It doesn't take us to where we want to go. So in my discipline of history, you have people on the right, like David Barton and others, who can fundraise millions of dollars to be able to promote this really, I believe, a very bad view of history, but they're going to continue to get that money because it's a view of history that serves a kind of Christian right, conservative kind of political agenda. And just to be fair, I think there are those funding organizations among historians who are progressive, secular, or whatever you want to call them, on the left, who really only sing one note about what American history is, and right now, I'll be honest with you, it's either race or patriarchy or Christian nationalism, who, all you have to do are mention those things in your grant application or talk about those things, and you're going to get certain kinds of money, certain kinds of invitations, certain kinds of opportunities, certain large numbers of followers, right? And all it does is kind of create these silos. It creates this polarization, and it doesn't really do anything to help us understand the complexity of the human experience.
Studying history is something that would help us
Yeah.
see the complexity of life in general. I mean, just to get yourself decentered and to go and read about people who lived in the distant past or not so distant past, but to understand that they are a different type of people and that I can learn something about just the human condition by
Yeah.
reading history and
Yeah.
and to be a different kind of person because of it. So
Yeah.
that's
And open yourself up to it.
yeah.
Open yourself up to the idea of that kind of engagement, right? Open yourself up to the idea of seeing yourself as part of a larger story, as part of a larger narrative, to try to understand people who are different than you and not just kind of, morally criticize them as your default position, right? I think history is one way. I think there are other ways too, but it's one way of kind of helping us to, do the work of in the church and in the society of kind of being reconcilers, peacemakers, doing the kind of work, to use your point before about work, and doing the kind of work that is kingdom building.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Wow, is
This
our
is
time up already? This flew
our
by.
time. I know time flies when you're having fun,
Yeah.
especially with old friends.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Well, thanks, guys. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, I wasn't good at math or like English. Those were not my subjects, language arts and all that. So history was my subject.
I like
Especially
history.
especially in elementary school, I really loved history, and then even high school. I had a really great high school history teacher. And again, it was one of those things where like all of the other students didn't really like them at all. And like they were like, oh, I can't stand them. And I was like,
They're missing out. They're
I'm
just
like,
missing out.
I think they're great. Yeah.
So
But I think that's why I loved it when I was little, because it felt like a lot of storytelling, especially. And then as you get a little older, you're like, oh, okay, like that actually happened too. Like it wasn't just a story I heard, like that was real life.
I
Appreciate
like
it.
it because it really does inform where we are today. So it's like,
Hmm.
how do we get here? Why do we think the way we think? Or why do we do the things we do? You're studying something that happened 200, 300 years ago, and you're like, oh, well, how about that? That's interesting.
Right.
That's how they thought about those things. And how did that carry through? It's changed through time. He's one of the C's. And so it's like, how did that change from the 1600s to the 1700s, 800, 1800s, now we're in the 2000s? How did that change? And it's just
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. And I remember my class at Kent State, like there was just a lot of students that had that mindset of like, why do I care if I'm studying something from 200 years ago or 300 years ago? Like that doesn't impact my life. And I'm like, no, actually, it really does. Like we're doing things today that we used to do 200, 300 years ago. Why? Like, why do we do that? Where did that come from? Like, ask those questions and it kind of piques a little more interest. Or we used to do things 200 years ago that we do, but now it's different. Why is it different? What did we change? Was it for the better? Are we worse because of it? Is
Right.
history repeating itself? Like, there's
Yeah.
all of these. I don't know. Yeah, I love that. My favorite question in history class was, when was the War of 1812? 1812.
You answered it.
My teacher actually put that on one of our tests when I was young. So it was mainly like, hey, just make sure you're awake and paying attention. When was the War of 1812? 1812.
I think it's a trick question. It
Right?
has to be a trick question.
Right. Like, it can't be 1812.
18, that can't be 1812. Why would he ask that question? It must have been 1814. I bet a few people got it wrong just because they thought it can't be
Probably.
1812.
The overthinkers, yep.